There have been thousands of conquests throughout human history, spanning centuries, geographical locations, and cultural traditions. But few have had such a significant impact on subsequent events as the Roman Republic's conquest of Greece, whose consequences have reverberated for millennia. Welcome to our film, which covers the Achaean conflict, the Seleucid War, the Italian War, the four Macedonian Wars, and the Roman intervention in Greek affairs. Please think before sharing these lengthy movies on social media, since they take a very long time to create. In February, the Mediterranean region is rife with ongoing conflict and political instability. 10 years prior, Carthage had been vanquished in the First Punic War by the Roman Republic's growing might, which established naval supremacy at sea. The Seleucid Empire, Ptolemaic Egypt, and Macedon, the Hellenistic kingdoms, compete for control of their border regions in the east. A number of lesser powers like Pergamon and the ostensibly autonomous Greek city-states are positioned between these larger polities. This is a late-century BC globe, but the future of the area will soon be permanently altered by a series of battles between Rome and Macedon, two emerging nations. Illyria, which included present-day Albania and Dalmatia, was considered to be a completely barbaric territory, at this time only partially civilized by interaction with its Hellenic neighbors. Even though the south and the coast had become somewhat more urbanized as a result of interaction with the Greek world, the area was still politically composed of several petty tribal chieftains. Since their first meetings, the people of Illyria have been perceived as tumultuous and aggressive. Occasionally, one of the several Illyrian tribes would temporarily surpass the majority of the others. In the 230s BC, this was the idea. They had united not only their own Illyrian peoples, but also notable individuals like Demetrius the Greek, Lord of Pharos, under the leadership of their vivacious king Agron. This new Illyrian force came to power at the same time as Epirus's once dominant monarchy collapsed and his once dominant might diminished. By exploiting this vulnerability, the Illyrians launched an invasion and ultimately took control of the Imperiate area located well south of the conventional line. This culminated in the capture of Phoinike, the kingdom's richest city. However, despite these achievements, Agron passed away shortly after, and his son was ostensibly his successor. His wife Tuda, who was swiftly named regent for her stepson, was actually the one with real authority. Illyrian aggression persisted after her ascent, and piracy in the Mediterranean grew worse during her rule. More staging places from which brigands might sail had been established as a result of the seizure of more southern Epirus lands. Although this had been going on for a while, the Senate finally took action due to the growing severity of the issue, the growing clamor of Roman merchants, and the financial damage that piracy was causing to the Republic. Instead of sending in the legions, the senators' first response in February was to dispatch a diplomatic embassy of the Corinth brothers to look into the matter, which was unusually quiet for the infamously hostile Romans. As was customary in Roman diplomacy, the Corinth brothers complained to Teuta about the growing piracy and insisted that it stop right away. The Illyrians would have an opportunity to abide by the demand amicably. If not, war would break out. Teuta declined this request, perhaps because she did not want to comply with Roman requests, or because she could not regulate the behavior of her dispersed tribal allies. In any event, the Romans were not pleased with this, and the issue was exacerbated when a Roman envoy was killed, possibly by the instructor herself at the heated discussion, or by the same pirates the embassy had been sent to thwart on the way home. The growth of the idea, a tribe's dominance over the area, was a deeper geopolitical reason, since Rome did not want any strong opponent in the Adriatic, even if the murder of the Roman ambassador was the direct cause of the conflict. A huge Roman army consisting of 22,000 soldiers and 200 ships pressed down on the Illyrians in the latter part of February during the campaigning season. It is known that the Roman mission was a total success from north to south, despite the fact that specifics of the brief campaign are forgotten. The Queen Regent's army was routed in the field, and almost instantly, Demetrius of Pharos Tuta's designated ruler of the freshly acquired island of Corcyra switched sides with the Romans. Tutor was compelled to sign a peace treaty with the Romans on February 28th, which divided her realm into lesser parts and prohibited piracy in the southern Adriatic Sea. Only their alakitia, or friendship, which sounds harmless, but would soon seem to be everything but remained after the Romans withdrew their troops. Essentially, becoming an informal client state was a de facto requirement of being a friend of Rome. Demetrius of Pharos, a defector, was one of the main beneficiaries of the Peace of 228. He was given a tiny autonomous principality of his own, situated between the Greek towns and the remains of the Idaean monarchy. It appears that the ambitious Demetrius was not satisfied with staying in his little kingdom despite these victories under Roman auspices, and he married Trituda, the biological mother of the Ardeaean monarch, soon after the peace was concluded. Demetrius of Varos successfully restored the strong Illyrian monarchy that Rome had destroyed during the First Illyrian War by taking on the role of the young boy's official regent. More audaciously, he started conducting raids and pillaging into the lands of tribes that were Roman allies. Demetrius could have been trying things out and thought the Romans couldn't or didn't want to get in because they didn't respond. This would turn out to be a deadly delusion for Demetrius, since the Romans were really preoccupied with the Gallic War in February. In an attempt to test his luck even further, Demetrius embarked on a massive pirate campaign in February, with 90 light galleys destroying communities throughout the Adriatic Sea in flagrant disregard for the contract that had been signed 8 years before. Rome determined that Demetrius, their erstwhile comrade, now constituted the same threat to Roman interests as Tutor did, and they wanted to punish their friend for abandoning them and not behaving as a friend should. He had now gone too far. The Republic's determination to quickly and decisively end the Illyrian problem before a new conflict with Carthage broke out, as it appeared to be doing, was likely the driving force behind the disproportionately large Roman activity that started in 0219. Demetrius's plan was to retain the castles of Pharos and Dimulum, but the Romans captured the former in under 7 days, while Demetrius lost Varos in a hasty expedition. Because he had positioned a squadron of covert galleys in a secret cove and fled to them after the fight was lost, the guy himself managed to avoid arrest. He escaped to the south on these ships, leaving his troops to be killed by the Romans and his family to be imprisoned by the Romans. Shortly afterward, Demetrius arrived at Actium, a port on the Adriatic Sea, where the navy of Philip V of Macedon, a powerful Hellenistic monarch, was docked. Demetrius was warmly received by the monarch upon his arrival, and soon rose to prominence as an advisor. In the meanwhile, there was no longer any military presence in the area after the Romans evacuated all of their troops. Once more, they merely left their friendship behind, but they had shown the powerful Macedonian kingdom to the south that they were willing to step in and help in the east. Before moving on, we must briefly travel back in time and look at Macedon's history following the death of Pyrrhus of Epirus, its would-be conqueror at Argos. By February, Antigonus II Gonatas, the winner of the war, had solidified his hold on Macedon and consolidated his dominance over the Greek city-states. Having won the allegiance of his unstable native nation, Antigonus made every effort to keep it. He was careful to maintain Macedonian coinage as high-quality currency, restructured the provincial administration to make it more efficient, and built a large holy monument to honor the Achaean house's dead. Antigonus made effective use of Macedon's exhausted resources and finances by emphasizing mobility and access. He made extensive use of the great naval fleet and the Antigonid fleet to transport troops to key locations, including the great naval fortresses of Demetrius, Chalcis, and Corinth. In the February Cremonidian War, an attempt by the Athenians commanded by Ptolemaic to overthrow Macedonian dominance was unsuccessful. Even though Antigonus was able to put a halt to this uprising, his rule ultimately came to an end in February, when he passed away, losing important strongholds like Corinth. Demetrius II, his successor, governed for a rather quiet 10 years, during which time Macedon's position deteriorated much further. He passed away on February 29th. Philip V, the late king's own son, was only a little boy when his father passed away, and Macedon could not afford a child ruler at such a dangerous moment. It was evident that a regent was needed for the time being, and Antigonus Dason, a distant Antigonid relative, was selected for the position. In addition to raising the infant Philip as his own son, Antigonus Dason, one of the lesser-known but more capable Macedonian monarchs of the century BC, actively embarked on a war to defeat Macedon's adversaries. He marched north and drove the Illyrians out of the kingdom. Then he struck south and drove the Aetolian League out of the country to consolidate and settle the situation in Macedon proper. Antigonus prudently renounced all Macedonian claims south of the Thermopylae Pass after securing his frontiers. The army's answer was to insist that Antigonus take the throne. Philip V's royal rights were neither seized or revoked during this time, and Antigonus promptly named him the legitimate heir. Philip V succeeded to the throne when Antigonus III Doson died in 0221, leaving behind a revived stable and increasingly strong Macedon, following another string of triumphs, including the ever-present conquest of Sparta by a foreign army. The Aetolian League and its supporters once again attacked Philip V and Macedonian rule shortly after he ascended to the throne in the Social War of 220 to 217. Philip was too young, in the League's opinion, to govern effectively. Demetrius of Pharos entered the royal court during this conflict. Now, catastrophic occurrences in the west started to garner more attention in the Mediterranean region. The Carthaginian general, Hannibal, had successfully crossed the Alps to attack Italy in 0218, marking the start of the Second Punic War. He had previously routed one Roman field army there at the Trabia River, and he annihilated another in Etruria's Lake Trasimene in February of 2017. After learning of these significant Roman setbacks, Philip V started to think about extending his empire in the west at the expense of the Roman Republic, which seemed to be in decline. Following his expulsion from his Adriatic realm by Rome, Demetrius of Pharos advocated for Philip to put an end to the social conflict, seize control of the Illyrian coast, and launch an attack on Italy. Philip subsequently drove the Illyrians from Macedon, once again accepted the military status quo, and put an end to the war in Greece at Naupactus. In February of that year, he had a fleet of 100 light vessels built. The monarch attempted to secure the coastal area of Illyria in February of 16, but left the country when he learned of an incoming Roman fleet. An other pivotal milestone was the Roman defeat at Cannae, which led Philip to send envoys to Hannibal in order to request a formal alliance. He undoubtedly desired to gain an advantage at Roman's expense and join the victorious side. According to legend Xenophanes, the envoy was apprehended by a Roman praetor when he was en route to speak with Hannibal. However, he was able to negotiate his release by claiming that his true purpose was to make peace with Rome. The Romans discovered the new danger they faced when the unlucky Xenophanes was caught once again while returning to Macedon with the formal pact with Hannibal in his grasp. Philip increased his aggression against coastal Illyria when the Punic Macedonian Treaty ended invading Corcyra on February 15th. When a significant offensive started on 02-14, this got worse. While 120 Macedonian galleys sailed along the Straits of Otranto, Philip's ground force marched north through Epirus to reach Illyria. During this expedition, Philip quickly took control of Oricum and besieged Apollonia, who then requested assistance from Rome. In order to break the siege of Apollonia and drive the Macedonians out of Oricum, two vital ports that could have served as a base for an attack on Italy, the Roman commander Levinus crossed the sea with 55 strong Roman vessels and a bolstered Adriatic fleet. Following these triumphs, Philip burnt his ships and withdrew overland to Macedon, while Lavernus wintered his fleet at Oricum. The Macedonian monarch, having been halted at sea, launched an assault over the Pintus Mountains, gaining considerable ground in 02-13 and 02-12. Without a strong Roman reaction, he conquered the tribal communities of Atintani, Partheni, and Daceretis in the interior. Since the Republic was still engaged in combat with Hannibal, they lacked the ground forces necessary for a side trip into the eastern Adriatic. When Philip was able to reach the Adriatic once more in the latter half of 02-12, this circumstance altered. He successfully captured the coastal stronghold of Lissus, another potential staging location, after hammering his way overland to the coast. The Romans realized they could no longer afford to ignore this eastern menace. Because the Carthaginian War had made it impossible for the Romans to neutralize Philip at this time, the Senate turned to diplomacy as a weapon and began luring other Greek nations to neutralize Philip on their behalf. Rome and the historically anti-Macedonian Aetolian League signed a pact after Rome was persuaded by the alliance by Roman triumphs in the Punic War in February 2011 at Tarentum and Capua. The Aetolians were given favorable terms. They would get whatever city or town they took, but unless the place was seized jointly, the Romans would keep the loot. Other allies of the Aetolians like Sparta, Elis, Licinia, the Illyrians, and possibly Pergamum may be included under a different category. The actual conflict was a bloody, inconclusive slogging match in which Philip V gained ground against the other members of the alliance, while the Romans captured numerous key cities including Antikyra. Non-combatant governments' attempts at peace negotiations were thwarted in February 2007 by Rome's willful derailment of the process, although they were progressively coerced into peace in February 2006 and February 2005. Rome's intention to punish Philip for his effort to kick them when they were down was evidently unfulfilled, even if the final treaty ending the war at Faunus ended hostilities for the time being. But there was no doubt that Rome was gradually winning the Second Punic War and would soon be ready to use all of its power against Macedon. Philip V continued to act aggressively, even after learning of the last Roman victory at Zama in February. Rather, he started exploiting Egypt's weakness, which alarmed many of his smaller neighbors. Egypt had been on a downward spiral since 207 BC. The three main Hellenistic monarchies, Antigonid, Macedon, Ptolemaic Egypt, and the Seleucid Empire, had maintained a balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean since the Battle of Ipsos. The other two kept one of the three from becoming a hegemon if it was growing too strong. When the priests of the Egyptian deity Amun declared a new king in February, exploiting local dissatisfaction with Ptolemaic power, this system started to fall apart. This sparked a terrible uprising that caused Upper Egypt as a whole to break away from the Alexandrian government. When King Ptolemy IV passed away too soon in 204 BC and was replaced by his 6-year-old son, Ptolemy, things took a further turn for the worst. The Alexandrian administration was left defenseless and crippled by disputes over the regency. It couldn't have come at a worse time. The Seleucid monarch, Antiochus III, had just returned from his extensive eastern wars, and the Roman-Philippine conflict had just come to a close. The nearly helpless overseas Ptolemaic lands were now eagerly sought after by both of these powerful monarchs, and in 222 BC Antiochus started the Fifth Syrian War to retake the historically contested areas of Cyprus and Coeli, Syria. The rapacious Philip V quickly acquired a number of the Cyclades Islands and built cordial connections with the several Greek cities along Asia Minor's western coast. But he soon infuriated Rhodes and Pergamon, who in 201 BC started war on him. Shortly thereafter, Philip invaded Pergamon proper after decisively defeating a combined Rhodian-Pergamon rescue attempt at the Siege of Chios. Philip failed to capture the city after soundly defeating his enemy's ground force beyond the walls. Philip chose to incorporate the majority of Caria and the Rhodian Perea straight into the emerging Macedonian Empire after realizing that any attempt to do so would simply deplete his armies. Despite being assaulted by the Rhodian naval at Lada in the fall, Philip's fleet prevailed. A Rhodian navy blockaded Philip in the Gulf of Bargelia on the Carian coast in February 2001, a time when the king reportedly found it difficult to provide for his soldiers and himself. They made the decision to seek assistance as they were aware that the king would eventually declare war on them and that they were losing the fight against Macedon. The Senate was informed by ambassadors from Egypt, Rhodes, and Pergamon that Philip had made a covert agreement with Antiochus III that would split the Ptolemaic territories among them. Since they believed that Antiochus and Philip, not Rome, posed the greatest threat to their independence, these smaller, weaker Hellenistic nations were the ones that allowed Roman participation in the Greek world. As expected, Philip was able to deceive his adversaries into allowing him to flee in February, and finally made his way back to Macedon. After his return, the northern Achaean campaign resumed on land, and the king stormed throughout the region until he arrived at Abydos, where he besieged it. The Roman Senate called for a vote in favor of war after witnessing the perilous collaboration between the two Hellenistic kings and this obvious Macedonian aggressiveness. However, battle fatigue and the fact that southern Italy had been decimated in the Second Punic War caused the People's Assembly to reject this call for yet another war. Consul Publius Sulpicius Galba stepped in and convinced the assembly to declare war by drawing a comparison between the growing Macedonian danger and the great Italian invaders Pyrrhus and Hannibal. Three well-known senatorial diplomats embarked on a significant diplomatic trip in the east, while Philip prolonged his siege of Abydos and the Roman troops set up its supply routes across the Adriatic. Their message was unambiguous. Peace would prevail provided Philip did not declare war on the Greeks and paid Pergamon for their damages. The Macedonian monarch boldly refused to accept the Roman envoys and declared war. The loss of Abydos, whose people committed mass suicide because they did not want to live under Philip's authority, marked the beginning of the Second Macedonian War. When the king came to Macedonia in February, he discovered that 50 vessels were berthed on the island of Corcyra, and that 20,000 Romans had already landed in Apollonia under Galba. Philip decided to launch an assault into the Peloponnese, initially concentrating on the periphery dangers. In order to get ready for the campaign, Consul Galba raided the Illyrian countryside at the same time. He is infamous for having sacked Antipatria so completely that it didn't recover until 700 years later. Publius Villius Topulus succeeded the feeble and ill Galba after the latter failed to attack Macedon over the highlands. Villius's situation worsened when he took command and was soon confronted with a revolt among the legions. 2,000 Second Punic War soldiers disobeyed instructions because they believed they had been apart from their farms and families for too long. Although the Roman army was temporarily halted, Villius is credited for hearing their grievances and pledging to bring them up with the Senate. He then marched and set up camp close to an Aulus River canyon. Shortly earlier, Philip V had also come here, establishing his own army in a fortified defensive position along the main road between Macedon and Apollonia. Villius's leadership had come to an end, and he was replaced, right once after setting up camp at the Aeos, by Titus Quintius Flamininus, a dynamic member of the aristocratic Quintia family. Despite being too young to hold the position legally, this ardent, hot-tempered, and giving Philhellene was chosen to the consulship in January 1998, after serving successfully as the governor of Tarentum in the past. He almost instantly left for the Greek East, with 3,000 experienced men, disregarding the customary honors and administrative tasks a new consul would do in Rome. Flamininus dispatched an ambassador to demand talks with Philip after arriving at the Roman army at the Aeos and removing Villius from leadership. On each side of the swift-moving Auls, with their respective groups of generals and advisors in tow, the king and consul squared up. Philip made an effort to persuade Flamininus to reach a compromise by stating that each acquired city would require a different approach, and suggesting that an impartial tribunal make the choice. Flamininus, however, declared that his goal was to free all Greek nations and refused to accept any kind of compromise. In order to do this, he had Philip I give up Thessaly, a region that had been a part of Macedon for 120 years. This purposefully unreasonable demand was successful in pressuring Philip to end the talks and go back to his strong defensive stance. Without any delay, the Roman commander gave the order for his light infantry and missile soldiers to engage Philip's men in projectile duels. While 4th and 300 carefully chosen legionaries, led by an Epirote nobleman called Charops, maneuvered around a detour, up and over the mountains. This diverted the attention of the Macedonians and their commander. Flamininus advanced once this flanking force was established, and the Macedonians retreated to avoid becoming ensnared in the Roman pincer. Even more devastating than the loss of Philip's vital baggage train was the demoralization this setback inflicted on Macedon's Greek allies. The Achaean League, Macedon's most potent ally, was among the several faltering countries that either announced their support for the Romans or stayed neutral when the king returned to Macedon with his battered army. Flamininus was unable to make a decision in the next campaign, and he eventually retreated for the winter after being enmeshed in a siege in Atrax. Simultaneously, Philip started enlisting even young people and elderly men for battle in anticipation of a major conflict the next year. Flamininus broke up peace talks when the extension of his command for glory hunting failed. Philip marched south in the spring of 1997, stopping at the village of Ferry, where his troops started to scrounge for supplies and even sighted some Roman scouts. Flamininus and his army marched north from Boeotia after learning of the Macedonian presence in the hopes of stopping Philip before he could flee. The two armies eventually approached one another on a dismal, foggy morning close to Cynocephaly, a sloping mountain. Let's take a minute before the conflict starts to look at the makeup of the opposing forces that clashed on the Thessaly hills. With 2 Roman and 2 allied legions, Flamininus's field army numbered about 20,000 deadly legionary soldiers, many of whom were seasoned Punic War veterans. This Roman army corps was covered by 2,000 velites, while its flanks were guarded by 500 equite cavalry and even 200 war elephants. The Roman army had a sizable detachment of Greek allies in addition to these Italian soldiers. 6,000 infantry and 400 cavalry from the Aetolian League joined the army, along with 200 light infantry from Epirus and 800 archers from Crete. Flamininus had about 32,000 soldiers in all, 2,000 elite hegemopeltists, 4,000 Illyrian and Thracian mercenaries, 500 Greek hoplite mercenaries, and 2,000 Thessalian and Macedonian cavalry joined Philip's army of 16,000 Sarissa, with phalangists on the opposite side of the slope. Although each commander was aware that his counterpart was nearby, the two armies were confused by their diminished eyesight due to the fog. In order to gain a better perspective, Philip sent a squad of swift-moving skirmishers to the peak of the mountain and began marching in the morning. Upon reaching the summit, 1,000 velites and 10 Roman cavalry squadrons sprang from the murk and launched an assault. Despite some losses, both scouting contingents were able to inform their superiors of the situation on the Cynocephaly Ridge. Flamininus responded quickly, bringing reinforcements to the crest in the form of 500 cavalry and 2,000 Aetolian soldiers. The Antigonid skirmishing army gradually withdrew to the top of the slope after their arrival, tipped the scales in favor of the Romans, and they sent desperate messengers to Philip for assistance. Since the monarch was unwilling to engage in combat in such unfavorable terrain, he dispatched 3,500 cavalry and mercenary infantry to support his scouting team. The Romans were now forced back down the slope by the additional troops. After this shifted the balance. According to Polybius, they were nearly routed, but the Aetolian allies' deft skirmishing and harassing saved them. Now, as the fog was being burned away by the early light, Flamininus and his whole army could see their soldiers losing the fight on the slope that the Romans could see. The main Roman army was dismayed by the seeming defeat of the Roman skirmishing unit, but their commander managed the situation well. Flamininus spoke to his army at the foot of the slope, directing them all to gather in battle order. Using all the oratory talents a well-known politician would possess, he declared to them that he had previously battled and defeated these individuals. In the meantime, the victorious Antigonid skirmishers wrote to Philip in exultation, pushing the king to strike while the momentum was in their favor. Therefore, the army was ordered to deploy in combat order. Philip was only able to assemble half of his men because of the battle's lack of preparation. He instructed his commander, Nicanor, to follow up when the other soldiers had returned. With the Peltasts serving as a screen and cavalry flanking the right wing, the king formed the right side of his line and led his phalanx up the slope in the hopes of rushing and overwhelming the Romans with its weight. Only the left half of Flamininus's line moved forward on the other side of the slope to support the ongoing conflict between the two scouting teams. The Macedonians now retreated back up the slope due to the heavy infantry's involvement in the battle. Many were slain, and others ran back to their king. Since sound and sight were still covered by a thin fog, the two half armies that were now advancing up each side of the slope directly towards one another were still utterly oblivious of the other's existence. This may have prevented the Roman left from seeing Philip's 8,000-man force as they ascended the slope in front of them. But suddenly, both armies were visible. Quickly forming a double-depth formation, the phalangists lowered their sarissas and surged down the slope toward the Romans who were ill-prepared. Flamininus's scouting group barely had time to gather before they were struck by the phalangists. The major battle took place in the middle, but there were also skirmishes between the light infantry and the Antigonid and Roman cavalry, as well as clashes between metal pikeheads and the massive Roman shields on the wings. Even while the Roman left resisted the pressure with courage and tenacity, the bristling pike wall was gradually consuming it. When Nicanor's bigger troop started to climb the slope on the king's left flank in a hurried marching order, Philip's encounter battle appeared to be about to become better. Flamininus was being driven back more and closer to the Roman camp, despite his best efforts to rally the struggling soldiers on the left from behind the line. The Philhellene commander twisted his horse and charged at the unoccupied Roman right, which was now being roared by the war elephants after realizing that his left would soon crumble under the weight of the Valens. When Flamininus arrived, he gave the order for his troops on this side of the battlefield to rush at Nicanor's confused men, the majority of whom were either still forming up or were just arriving. The Romans now destroyed Philip's army's corps of phalangists, who were nearly worthless if not used strictly. Many Macedonian soldiers fled and were pursued by the legionaries, while many more were slaughtered outright. Philip had won on the Roman left, but Flamininus had smashed Nicanor, giving the impression that the war was still up for grabs. However, 20 maniples, or around 2,500 of the troops on the right wing, who were most likely seasoned triarii, were now stopped by an unknown Roman tribune who must have enjoyed great esteem among the troops. When the nameless military tribune saw that the Roman left wing was struggling, he led his unit of well-behaved soldiers across the mountain and then attacked Philip's triumphant phalanx from behind. Simultaneously, the enraged and motivated legionaries who had endured hours of suffering under the Macedonian invasion launched another attack. The rigid phalanx broke apart as a result of this shrewd move, and many of its phalangists were slain. In a futile attempt to rouse his troops, Philip rode up and down the line, but he soon recognized it was futile and galloped off the battlefield. A particularly horrific massacre took place as the Romans were busy slaughtering the last of the opposing forces. A group of Macedonian phalangists raised their pikes straight to the heavens in the customary surrender gesture. The enraged legionaries nonetheless stormed in and slew them all. The legion had defeated Alexander's phalanx, and the fight was finished. Only about 700 Romans were killed, primarily on the left, which had resolutely resisted the assault. 8,000 Antigonid soldiers were killed, and another 5,000 were taken prisoner, resulting in devastating losses. At the next conference at Tempe, Philip was subjected to humiliating conditions of peace. He was forced to abandon the gains he had made in Asia Minor and Thrace, as well as to evacuate all of Greece, including Thessaly. His son, Demetrius, was taken as a captive to Rome. His navy was decimated, and a substantial war indemnity was requested. Last but not least, Philip would become a client king of Rome, basically a puppet. Although any realistic attempts at Macedonian resurgence were destroyed by this battle, they continued to strive. Following the conclusion of the peace conference at Tempe Titus, Quinctius Flamininus made the firm decision that Rome would be Greece's real savior. After more than a century of Macedonian control, Flamininus announced during the Isthmian Games in spring 186 that Rome would leave the Greeks free, untaxed, and independent. At the celebrations, he was surrounded by people and lavished with praise from the appreciative city-states. The victory at Cynocephaly prompted the Roman Senate to declare 5 days of gratitude. A group of envoys, sent by the Seleucid king Antiochus III, also met Flamininus at the Games to congratulate the consul on his triumph and to reassure the Romans of their liege's peaceful intentions. They encountered demands and icy sternness. Antiochus was instructed not to try to cross into Greece, to avoid the Greek cities, and to remove his garrisons from those he had previously taken. We must now follow the wary envoys back east, where they communicated the Roman demands to their ruler, Antiochus III. Told Antiochus III, their ruler, about the demands of Rome. Antiochus, also called the Great, was bringing the Fifth Syrian War to a close against his long-standing adversary, the Ptolemies of Egypt, while Rome and Macedon were engaged in combat at Cynocephaly by the Ptolemies of Egypt, his longtime adversary. By the last year of the war, Alexander Seleucus's Diadochi created dominion had grown to be the largest empire in its day, capturing Ptolemy's possessions in Asia, including Caria Lycia, Cilicia, and Coele-Syria. Therefore, it is not surprising that Antiochus, regarded as one of the greatest commanders of his day, was upset about the southern Asia Minor coast, and likely intended to build a fleet off the coast of southern Asia Minor, with the intention of invading Ephesus, Egypt. But the westward march of his navy caused Rhodes to react. Antiochus agreed to give the Rhodians Halicarnassus and refrain from establishing a foothold on Samos in return for his fleet's unrestricted access to Rhodian waterways, since the little island lacked the strength to contend with the Seleucids on land, but possessed a powerful navy. Antiochus seized the remaining Ptolemaic possessions in Asia Minor, including the vital Ephesus, in January, after a conflict was averted. He subsequently made the decision to subjugate the weaker Macedonia, capturing Abydos and Ilium in the process, giving him the ideal position from which to cross the Hellespont. In an indication of how things had changed over the past 10 years, the residents of neighboring Lampsacus sent envoys to the Romans requesting protection because they were afraid they might be the next to be targeted. The cities in the region were ruled by the Thracians at the time, and Antiochus was well aware that the Greeks would want a return to Hellenic governance. He then besieged Matitos after crossing the Hellespont and capturing Chersonesos. Other cities were obliged to capitulate after the latter fell, and Antiochus expanded his power by reconstructing Lysimachia, which essentially sealed off the Gallipoli Peninsula. Some Greeks may have been impressed by this, but the Romans were not amused and believed that Antiochus had violated the ultimatum by capturing Gallipoli. Two men dominated Roman politics: Publius Cornelius Scipio, Africanus, the hero of the battle against Carthage, and Titus Quinctius Flamininus, the victor of Cynocephalae. The Republic dispatched a diplomatic delegation to Lysimachia to demand that Antiochus leave Europe and return the Ptolemies' lost possessions in Asia Minor after the latter sought to immediately march soldiers into Greece, but the Flamininus-led peace faction won out. By the time it got there, though, Antiochus had already made peace with Egypt by marrying his daughter and 10-year-old Ptolemy V, and he declared that he would no longer battle Ptolemy because he was his son-in-law. News of the Ptolemaic king's death reached them while discussions went on. The Roman fears that the Seleucids sought even more land were confirmed when Antiochus abruptly ended negotiations and hurried to Ephesus and then to Antioch. Although we don't have all the information, we do know that the king tried to invade Cyprus, but the mission failed because of a mutiny or a storm. Antiochus intended to launch a frontal attack on Egypt after returning to shore, but he learned that Ptolemy was still alive. The campaign ended before it started. After signing a peace agreement with his son-in-law, Antiochus went back to Ephesus. The Seleucid king persisted in use diplomacy to strengthen his position abroad throughout this time. The Attalid dynasty's Pergamon was the Seleucids' traditional rival. In an attempt to change that, he married his daughter Antiochus to Eumenes II, the king of Pergamon. Eumenes II decided that an alliance with the Romans was better and turned down the proposal. But Antiochus was unfazed and formed a marriage alliance with Ariarathes, the king of Cappadocia. Antiochus desired the support of the renowned Celtic soldiers, so his diplomats delivered the Galatians expensive gifts at the same time. A January incident demonstrates to a contemporary audience the interconnectedness of the ancient world. But to the ancients themselves, it further complicated the diplomatic position. After being banished from his native nation, renowned Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca came to the Seleucid court in Ephesus with the intention of becoming a mercenary leader. Antiochus greeted him courteously, but kept him at a distance, likely fearing Hannibal would overshadow him. Concerned about Hannibal's approach, the Romans dispatched their own representatives. The diplomats purposefully focused more on the exile in an attempt to create tension between the monarch and the latter. Hannibal, seeing that this was dangerous related to Antiochus, how his father Hamilcar forced him to take an oath of perpetual hate against the Romans. The Carthaginians' reputation in the court was instantly enhanced by this. The Seleucid presence in Europe was the main topic of the ongoing diplomatic discussions between the Romans and Seleucids between January 1993 and January. But the discussions were fruitless. The Italian League was another regional power seeking alliances. They dispatched envoys to Antiochus because they were concerned about the Roman alliance with their adversary, the Achaean League. The Seleucid king sent an envoy to the Aetolian assembly in January after agreeing to form an alliance. Surprisingly, the latter passed a resolution asking Antiochus to free Greece and resolve the Aetolian-Roman conflict. Antiochus consented to travel into Greece when the Aetolians pledged to provide him with their men, even though he knew it was a move that may start a war with the Romans. The king couldn't turn down the offer without losing status. Hannibal persuaded Antiochus to go to battle according to Roman historians, but Antiochus was already in Syria at the time. The Aetolians were the ones who initiated the conflict. In an attempt to seize control of the city and exert pressure on the Achaean League, their men assassinated the unpopular Spartan king Nabis. However, the inhabitants rebelled, forcing the invaders to flee. Sadly, the Spartans were left helpless, and shortly after, warriors from the Achaean League invaded the city and compelled it to join the League, thereby ending Spartan independence. However, the Italians were not deterred, and they seized Demetrius, a city with a great harbor, to provide Antiochus with a suitable location to land his troops. After making a sacrifice to the goddess Athena at Ilium, the king began to cross the Aegean Sea in the anti-Seleucid camp, since his little fleet could not carry all of his soldiers. After disembarking at Demetrius, Antiochus proceeded south to Lamia, the location of the Aetolian assembly. He was chosen league head here and greeted as a liberating hero. Nevertheless, the monarch was in a precarious situation. The Seleucids had no obvious military target because the Romans had no troops in the area, and the Greek liberator could not fight the Greeks. Without one, Antiochus was once more searching for allies. He moved closer to Chalcis, a vital city that had been defended by Achaean and Attalid armies since the conclusion of the Second Macedonian War. The king had enough men to capture the city by force, but he chose not to risk the blood of fellow Greeks and went back to Demetrius after being scolded for trying to persuade the population to join him. He then dispatched representatives to Macedonia, the Achaeans, Athens, and the Athenians. Philip V, still in shock at his loss at Cynocephaly, was waiting. The Achaeans chose to stay in their alliance with Rome, and the latter were either a Greek or Hellenized tribe that gained importance during the chaos of the Didochi Wars and consented to assist. The Athenian front was considerably more striking. The oligarchic party wished to back Antiochus, a democratic party that represented the Romans. The Seleucid supporters were crushed in bloody street fighting that resulted from the former's invitation of the Achaean League's warriors. The praetor Marcus Babius was dispatched to Apollonia with around 20,000 Romans and Italics, since Rome was aware of the Seleucid action. Babius's presence was sufficient to hold Macedon in check, even though the Romans outnumbered Antiochus. They didn't want to appear like an aggressor. Therefore, they didn't declare war. Regretfully, the Romans were forced to back their allies, and Babius dispatched 500 legionaries to Chalcis when the garrison requested reinforcements. Since Antiochus gave his admiral Polixenidas the command to march south with the rest of his army and block the small Euripus Strait between Chalcis and mainland Greece, we might presume that this was the final straw for Antiochus. The Roman force proceeded south to await shipments at Delium, when the Seleucid fleet barred it by the time it reached the bridge. The conflict that would subsequently be known as the Seleucid War, the Syrian War, and the Battle of Antiochus started when the Seleucids besieged and defeated this unit shortly after. Although the word reached Antiochus following the battle at Delium, some accounts assert that the Romans had already declared war at that time. Antiochus permitted the Chalcis garrison to depart under a truce, still hoping to win an alliance with the Achaeans and the Pergamene. The remainder of Euboea soon submitted to the monarch. The cities of the Boeotian League, which promptly submitted, and the Thessalian League, which the Romans established during the Second Macedonian War, were his next objectives. Antiochus continued to try to negotiate, but he saw that the League's members were beginning to organize under the guise of these discussions. As a result, he moved quickly in early 119 BC to seize Pherae, the League's capital, and massacred its defenders. He then advanced into the League's domain, and in a brief but victorious campaign, seized control of most of the local cities with the exception of Larissa, which was under siege by the Seleucids. Antiochus dispatched 2,000 warriors to the field of Cynocephali in the south, while the siege was still in effect. His warriors buried the Greek dead, leaving their bones on the battlefield as a symbolic act. The Seleucid king was attempting to demonstrate his piety in contrast to the savage Romans and his greater concern for fellow Hellenes than Philip. The latter proclaimed his loyalty to Rome, viewing this act as an outright insult. Babius gained military access by engaging in talks with the Macedonian monarch right away. Under Appius Claudius, a legionary detachment of 2,000 troops was dispatched south, most likely for reconnaissance purposes. In order to inflate his numbers, the Roman commander probably landed at Tempe and constructed a bigger camp with more campfires, though specifics are unknown. The weather and supply situation most likely caused Antiochus to lift the siege despite the fact that some accounts claim that Antiochus was duped into believing that the Roman Macedonian onslaught was approaching. He quickly began his retreat to Chalcis nonetheless. Now, spring was awaited on both sides. Antiochus determined that another dynastic marriage was necessary at Chalcis, but this time he married a local noble's daughter, maybe to show the small Greek nobles who controlled most city-states that he supported them. These royal weddings were popular in the East, but the people didn't like them, since they thought it was bad for waging war. Furthermore, the king's involvement in the festivities further damaged his reputation, as the Greeks were once again astounded by their Macedonian brethren's custom of consuming unadulterated wine. While on the island, Antiochus kept searching for allies, but found none. Additionally, he dispatched emissaries to Asia to request reinforcements. Not that the Romans were idle. The consul of the year Scipio's ally, Manius Acilius Glabrio, was to lead a fresh force of 15,000 men to Greece, as part of the agreed alliance with the Achaean League Pergamon and Rhodes. He appointed two former consuls, Marcus Porcius Cato and Valerius Flaccus, as delegates, demonstrating the importance of this conflict for the Romans. The fact that both delegates were members of Flamininus's party is particularly noteworthy. This indicates that the opposing groups set aside their disagreements in order to defeat Antiochus. Cato arrived in the Peloponnese and embarked on a diplomatic tour of Achaea and Athens, while the main army was crossing the Adriatic. He mockingly asserted that Antiochus battles with pen and ink and conducts war with letters. Babius and Philip V began their war against the Seleucid garrisons in Thessaly before Calabrio arrived in Illyria in March. All of the advances Antiochus won during his war in Thessaly were undone when the Athermanians, the only significant anti-Roman army in the area, were swiftly routed and followed by the Seleucid garrisons. In the meantime, Antiochus gathered his army in Boeotia before moving westward to seize Acarnania and exert pressure on the Epirotes to join his forces. Acarnania was also crucial for cutting the direct path between Italy and the Achaean League, and for acquiring a port in the Ionian Sea. Through diplomatic pressure, Macedon became a supporter of the Seleucid cause. The Acarnanians and Epirotes, however, proclaimed their support for the Romans, who now possessed over 35,000 soldiers in the region, and were backed by an army of 5,000 from Philip. Even with the Aetolian recruits, Antiochus's army was still under 20,000 strong, perhaps because of the allied Rhodian and Attalid activities in the Aegean Sea. There were no friends to be found in Greece, and no reinforcements from Asia were on the horizon. He was outnumbered 2-1 and could not remain in Aetolia, since his supply and escape lines were now in danger due to the Roman march south. He didn't want to desert the Aetolians either. In typical Hellenic form, Antiochus pushed for Thermopylae after the allies first chose to defend at Lamia, which would have allowed the Romans to outflank them. As a natural choke point, protected by Mount Tychius and Mount Kalidromos from the southwest and the waters of the Malian Gulf from the northeast, this well-known spot has seen many final stands before and after April. However, this ostensibly perfect defensive posture had a deadly weakness, as Leonidas and Xerxes had found 300 years earlier. A small army could have blocked a much bigger force in the passage, but the mountains offered several pathways, allowing one to outflank the defenders. Given their cultural immersion in Greek mythology and history, both armies were undoubtedly aware of this. Antiochus had about 12,000 footmen and barely 500 horses, with a few thousand Aetolians remaining to defend the vital town of Heraclea. The Seleucids had to battle in the small tunnel to prevent being outflanked, because the Roman cavalry outnumbered them 4-1. The monarch constructed a wall over the gate and positioned a few ballistae and catapults on top of it after sending 2 groups of Aetolians, each with 1,000 hoplites, to shut off the most noticeable mountain pathways. His phalangites gathered up in front of the walls, with the peltasts in front of them, while his skirmishers were positioned on the high ground to the left of the route to launch their missiles on the Romans who were moving forward. In a similar vein, 2/3 of the Roman army was present, with the remainder encamped and guarding Thessaly and Heraclea. Calabrio had to strike at the tiny choke point and tie up the Seleucid soldiers, even though he knew he couldn't take the passage against the phalanx. 2 contingents of 2,000 legionaries each, led by Cato and Flaccus, were dispatched to capture the mountain passes. Gladio was compelled to abandon his cavalry and a contingent of infantry to defend the Roman camp after it was invaded by the neighboring Aetolians before to the conflict, according to some accounts. The sources that describe the combat are not entirely consistent. We are aware that Flaccus was given the command to make the nighttime pass at Mount Tychius. While one account asserts that the Romans encountered the Italians, the hoplites remained firm, and the legionaries failed to penetrate, losing hundreds of soldiers and retreating. Another author suggests that this unit lost its way during the march. At Mount Kalidromos, Cato's attack on the Aetolians proved more effective. Many Aetolians were slain by the Roman strike when they apparently caught some of them dozing off, but the Hapotes quickly formed a line across the pass, giving neither side the upper hand. The main Roman troops launched a direct attack at the same time. Despite some damage from the skirmishers and Peltus's volleys, the disciplined Romans locked their shields and kept on advancing, despite the field artillery's casualties. When Antiochus noticed the approaching Romans, he gave the order for his Peltus to retreat, while his pikemen advanced in a phalanx. Due of the legionaries' inability to approach the phalangites and their inability to outflank the enemy, the Romans suffered the majority of their fatalities there. The phalanx gradually drove the legion back, but by the early hours of the morning, Cato's army began to gain ground close to Calidromus as he was able to rotate more men into the battle and outnumber the Aetolians 4-1. The hoplite line was eventually broken by the Romans, which caused it to retreat in fear. Before long, both parties were on the plain, and the legionaries were pursuing them, murdering their enemies. Despite the king's valiant efforts to halt them, the phalanx withdrew to the camp to create another formation after realizing that its rear was now in danger. However, the phalangites were unable to line up because Cato's detachment arrived at the camp before the Seleucids, and the Roman main body soon followed. Now, it was all men for themselves. Over 10,000 Seleucids and Aetolians were either slain or captured, and Antiochus withdrew his cavalry from the battle. According to Livy, the Romans lost 200 soldiers, although this figure is most likely inflated. The Romans slept for a day after eliminating the survivors before focusing on Heraclea, a stronghold whose west was defended by Mount Oeta and a citadel on low slopes and whose south was shielded by the river Asopos. Due to its tiny size, the entire wall could be manned by a small Italian garrison. Additionally, the fortifications were short, preventing the Romans from using their overwhelming numerical advantage. When Democritus, the garrison's commander, rejected Calabrio's demand that they surrender, the Romans began building battering rams in anticipation of a siege. When the siege started, the legionaries used ladders and rams to attack the walls, but the front's narrowness prevented them from overwhelming the Aetolians, who then swarmed out, burning some of the rams and pushing the enemy back with their spears. The attack was unsuccessful, but the Romans had more soldiers, so they dispatched more, and the following day they attacked the walls. Due to their lack of this luxury, the garrison became progressively more exhausted with each new attack. After 23 days of this, Glabrio finally came up with a strategy. To provide the impression that there would not be an attack, his troops were told to return to the camp. The weary Aetolians became complacent as a result, leaving the walls to sleep inside the homes. Legionaries were told to attack a section of the walls and create as much noise as they could late at night. Tiberius Sempronius, Calabrio's legate, was likewise ordered to relocate his force to a different area of the walls. The second party was already using ladders to scale the ramparts when the Aetolians were awakened by the noise and began to rush, arriving at the walls in time to chastise the Romans. The Aetolians left their posts and withdrew to the fortress upon realizing that, after their forces had finished plundering the city, the Roman commander started planning an invasion of the castle. While the remainder of the army gathered around the defenders, his engineers began constructing siege engines on the neighboring hill to attack them. Democritus gave in because the Italians were nearly out of food, and more significantly, had no means of retaliating against the catapults. It's probable that the Romans lost more soldiers during the conquest of Heraclea than they did during the Battle of Thermopylae, though we don't know the exact figures. The king fled to Chalcis, following the loss at Thermopylae. He could have been able to defend the island of Euboea and maintain it as a foothold there, but that plan was abandoned when Glabrio advanced south, forcing the Boeotian League to yield, and the Seleucid supply convoy surrounding Andros was destroyed by the Roman fleet under Aulus Atilius. Thus, in January, the monarch set off on his return trip to Asia. Many factors contributed to Antiochus's defeat in Greece, but these are the main ones. Roman logistics and diplomacy were superior. Most Greeks did not believe that the Seleucid king was freeing them from the Romans, and even his Aetolian allies did not commit all of their forces. Calabrio had to focus on the Aetolians since he lacked an army large enough to pursue the king across the ocean. The strain on the League increased as he went north once again and captured Lamia. In June, the latter dispatched messengers to Antiochus requesting that he either pay money or return so that they might battle on. The affluent monarch had no financial difficulties. Therefore, the envoys brought money back to Greece. The Seleucid cause in Greece was waning, even if the money had given the Aetolians a renewed sense of purpose. In July, Glabrio besieged Naupactos deep within Aetolian territory, while Demetrius and Elis's meager garrisons were forced to flee, with Elis and Messenia coming under Achaean rule. After 2 months of the siege, Flamininus came and mediated a ceasefire once more. Glabrio's army subsequently moved to its winter quarters, while Flamininus and Aetolian ambassadors traveled to Rome in the hopes of striking a peace settlement. At the same time, things were happening out at sea, while the king himself proceeded with 30,000 men to Lysimachia to protect his victories in Thrace. Antiochus instructed Seleucid Admiral Polixenides, who possessed around 40 warships and 60 smaller boats, to keep an eye out for a potential naval attack. Although there are few specifics, Polixenides possessed about 200 ships by August 70, of which were larger warships that were most likely quadraremes. The praetor Gaius Livius Salinato was the new Roman admiral in the region. After assuming command of the fleet that had been docked since the Second Punic War, he set off to join Attilius's navy. Livius raided the Aetolian-controlled Keflonia and Zakynthos along the route, increasing the strain on the League, because this was before the truce was agreed upon. By the time he arrived at Attica in August, his fleet had grown to over 100 ships, 80 of which were formidable warships. Each party was aware of their obligations. To have equal numbers, the Romans had to join forces with their Rhodian and Pergamene allies, but Polixenidus' greatest chance of victory was to avoid this and fight each foe alone. The Seleucid Nomarch made the decision to relocate to Phocea in September. After learning that Livius was north of Delos and that the Attalids had moved their navy to Elaea, he proceeded for Samos nevertheless, after losing the Roman navy and supposing it had moved south to join the Rhodians. This was an error, since a week or two later, the Romans joined the Pergamon navy, which was led by King Eumenes II, increasing their total number of ships to 160. Polixenides was captured by the Allies in a location known as Chissus, off the coast of Chios, when they began pursuing him. The Seleucid navy was forced to evacuate after losing 23 ships in a brief engagement. Despite his setback, Polixenides remained unfazed and sailed quickly in the direction of Samos, where he was able to ambush the Rhodian fleet and destroy 24 ships. The Allied fleet was on its way, and another Rhodesian navy, led by Eudorus, was advancing on Polixenides from the south, so he chose the only safe path left to Ephesus. Nevertheless, the consequences of this victory were little. For the time being, the Romans simply blockaded Polixenides, since it is usually foolish to attack a navy at a dock that is guarded by ground artillery. The Attalid monarch was urged to protect the Hellespont because the Republic was preparing an invasion of Asia Minor in January. Antiochus found himself in yet another unpleasant situation when Eumenes approached the Hellespont. In order to maintain pressure on Philip V, he desired to retain Gallipoli. However, since his navy was blockaded in Ephesus, and he had no means of thwarting the Attalid fleet, Antiochus might not be able to return to Asia Minor, particularly since the city of Byzantium and the kingdom of Bithynia were pro-Roman. Even though they did not join the war and could have stopped the king's army from crossing the Bosporus, the monarch had to protect the city in the event that Polixenides was completely vanquished. Therefore, he returned to Asia Minor before beginning his march towards Ephesus. A troop of Galatians was dispatched to assault Elea, while Antiochus detached his successor, Seleucus, to fight Pergamon. While Eumenes hurried to his city, Lucius Aemilius Regulus, another Roman praetor, had already taken control of the fleet and was compelled to commit some of his navy to defending Elea, which was vital to the Attalid war effort. Although we don't have all the information, it appears that both Seleucid armies were successful in their raids to a significant extent, but they weren't powerful enough to capture either city. When a small Achaean contingent arrived close to Elea and routed the Galatians around it, the campaign came to a conclusion. Overall, this brief expedition relieved Polixenides of enough pressure that when Antiochus dispatched envoys to Aemilius to seek a peace treaty, the Romans gave the matter careful thought and only turned it down after being persuaded by Eumenes. Seleucus went back to his father. A letter telling Hannibal to send his naval toward the blockade was delivered to Seleucia Pieria because the Seleucid leader needed his fleet to break free. We don't know why the king put a smart commander who had never commanded a navy in charge of one, but it seems that the Carthaginian utilized his extraordinary organizational abilities and understanding of Phoenician history to build a powerful navy of 50 ships in less than 2 years. Before Hannibal reached their home island, the Allies saw his westward progress and dispatched a part of the Rhodian fleet to stop him. At a location known as Eurymedon, southeast of present-day Antalya, the two fleets converged. The details are unknown, but Hannibal retired when his fleet was routed. The renowned Carthaginian general would ironically fight his final naval war. The fleets around Ephesus were now equal in strength, with half of the Allied navy serving on separate tasks. The Seleucid Nevarch also sailed out to surprise the enemy when the Romans went to attack neighboring Taus. However, it is unclear if Aemilius broke it up because of a lack of resources or to entice Polixenides out. But the larger Roman ships and their boarding techniques once again proved superior in the Battle of Meonesis. After losing a portion of his navy, Polixenides was compelled to disengage and head back to Ephesus. Following this fight, the Romans were able to enter Asia Minor without encountering any opposition since the Seleucids were outnumbered 4-1 in the sea. Antiochus began to concentrate his forces around Ephesus after realizing this. Following the Battle of Thermopylae, the immortal city's political groups resumed their squabbling. Scipio's faction gained power in January, and two of its members, including Publius Cornelius Scipio, Africanus's brother, Lucius Cornelius, another veteran of the Second Punic War, were appointed consuls. Furthermore, Africanus was able to secure his brother's leadership in Asia Minor and Greece while serving as a legate himself. The Scipios, being a war party, also chastised the Aetolians and Flamininus for their efforts to bring about peace. The ceasefire was announced to the Aetolians and Calabrio as the Scipios were getting their troops ready to cross to Epirus, and both sides promptly recommenced fighting. Calabrio turned against Lamia and launched a surprise attack after learning that the League's men were guarding the mountain passageways and that an attack on Naupactus would be challenging. Amphissa was the next victim of the Proprata. Despite being under siege, the city managed to hold out until January when the Scipios arrived. When the Aetolians requested another ceasefire, the Scipios consented to a truce in exchange for a $1,000 indemnity because the Romans, who now had over 50,000 men in the area, didn't want to waste time fighting them, as the campaigning season was coming to a close. The Romans then proceeded to Macedon and began negotiating with its ruler. Philip not only supplied the Romans and let them to travel through his realm, but 2,000 of his troops joined the Scipios in return for absolution of the war, indemnity, the release of his son, Demetrius, and small territorial gains. The Scipios eventually arrived to the deserted Lysimachia in January. Although a few garrisons in the region may have slowed down the Romans, Antiochus is sometimes blamed for his error in leaving Thrace undefended. However, it is likely that the king was attempting to gather all of the available forces for a general war. The fact that the Roman fleet captured Phocaea and the king did nothing to recover it is evidence of that. The legionaries soon took control of the Gallipoli Peninsula. Antiochus made an effort to persuade Prusius I, the king of Bithynia, to join him at this time, but his diplomatic efforts were unsuccessful, and Bithynia proclaimed its support for the Romans who crossed the Hellespont in late November. An ambassador from Antiochus welcomed the Scipios in Asia and presented them with a peace pact. The monarch was prepared to depart the cities of Troida and Thrace, and to reimburse half of the costs the Romans had expended throughout the conflict. The counteroffer to cover all costs and give up all the areas north and west of the Taurus Mountains was unacceptable, and his offer was turned down. According to some accounts, Antiochus promised to restore Africanus's son, Publius, in exchange for peace, after he was taken by the Seleucids during a small-scale conflict. The victor of Zama refused to back down and said that he would provide Antiochus III some helpful counsel. In exchange for his son, the king would be well advised to accept Roman demands in order to avoid conflict with the Romans. In December, the legions marched south with the help of the Athelid army when the discussions broke down. The Scipios were anxious to engage in combat soon because they feared that Lucius's authority may be revoked by the consuls in the next year. Galatia and Cappadocia sent reinforcements to Antiochus when he was at Thyatira. Since the Hermus River was the finest location to halt the Romans before they reached to Ephesus, he then moved north of Magnesia with the intention of defending there. The Roman Republic's troops arrived in the region a few days later, with a detachment of Galatian cavalry to the west of the Phrygias and some soldiers holding the passage. The Seleucid army established a walled camp in the valley between the river Hermus and its offshoot, the Phrygias. The legionary forces arrived on the scene on the 15th. At first, the Romans were outnumbered, and Seleucid missile units thwarted their advance efforts, but more were coming in and driving the defenders back. The Galatians were then ordered to attack the Roman right, which resulted in significant deaths. When more of Scipio's army joined the conflict, their numbers outnumbered the Galatians, who withdrew with casualties. Antiochus also increased his contingents, but the Romans' overwhelming numbers rendered it impossible to defend the crossing. They began pushing the river in other locations as well, so the king ordered his forces to retreat. The fighting lasted for a day. The Scipios began setting up camp at the meeting point of the Hermus and Phrygias after crossing, but they were assaulted once again, until the legionaries were compelled to form a battle line and drive the king's men back, the construction of the camp was repeatedly halted. After hours of fighting, the camp was eventually constructed. Both armies formed up in front of their fortifications because Antiochus was unwilling to give up his advantage in the number of horsemen and preferred a wider section, while the Romans wanted to fight close to their camp in the narrowest part of the valley, because the Seleucids had far more cavalry than their enemies. For 4 days, neither party made any progress in this situation. However, January was approaching, so the Romans took the initiative, but it was still insufficient in Antiochus's opinion. The Romans moved much nearer to the opposing camp that day. The monarch approved of the combat on December 22nd because he thought the battlefield was adequate. This fight is no exception to the always contentious issue of army proportions. Both the Achaean historian Polybius and the Roman historian Livy, who serve as our primary sources for the conflict, were unkind to Antiochus. They said that there were 2 times as many Seleucids as Romans. Both appear to believe that there were around 25,000 legionnaires left in Greece. But subsequent events that we shall discuss refute this, and contemporary historians believe that the armies were roughly 70,000 strong, more than 10,000 Achaeans, Macedonians, Thracians, and Pergamons, including 20,000 Histati, 20,000 Principi, 8,000 Triarii, and a few thousand Velites joined Scipio's army, which also included 20,000 Romans and 40,000 Italian allies. They had 4,000 cavalry, 3,000 Pergamon, and Achaean peltasts, 2,000 Macedonian phalangites, and a majority of Roman and Italic equites, and 1 Attalid heavy cavalry. Scipio chose not to deploy the 16 North African elephants that the Romans possessed to combat the larger and fiercer Seleucid Indian elephants. They were opposed by 23,000 light and missile infantry, including Cretan archers, Illyrian skirmishers, and peltasts, 34,000 heavy footmen, including 16,000 phalangites, 10,000 silver shield hypastists, and 3,000 Galatian and 2,000 Cappadocian swordsmen. As previously stated, Antiochus's army possessed more cavalry than their enemy, 4,000 light riders from Galatia Dacia, Dacia Arabia, and Greek Asia Minor, fighting as Tarentines, and 8,000 heavy cavalry composed of Armenian and Iranian cataphracts, Medinagama, and Hitteroi from the Macedonian elite. In addition, the monarch possessed an unspecified number of scythed chariots and 54 elephants. The legionaries formed 3 lines, forming a typical triplex 80 in a checkerboard pattern, with the left flanked by 1,000 Roman horsemen and the reserve elephants behind the center. The Phrygius protected the Roman center and left wing. The Macedonian and Thracian allies stayed behind to watch the camp under the direction of Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, the military tribune. The right, anchored by the Hermus, had Achaean and Pergamene peltasts in the column, while 3,000 cavalrymen in the various divisions of skirmishers and velites formed the vanguard. King Eumenes held the right. Former consul Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus held the left, and consul Lucius Scipio held the center. It appears that his brother Lucius served as the general commander because Scipio Africanus had been ill for weeks. The Seleucid center, under the direction of General Zeuxis, was constructed on the opposite side of the plain and surrounded by all of the Galatian and Phalangite troops. Each battalion consisted of 1 500 footmen and 2 elephants, for a total of 22 animals. With 4,000 heavy cavalry in the line, 16 elephants, and light Dahi cavalry behind them, all protected by silver shields. Antiochus himself led the right wing. With 4,000-strong horsemen at his side, Seleucus, the king's successor, was in command of the army's left flank. A group of scythed chariots led his troop, and the elephants and light cavalry were in line with the peltists and Cappadocians in the middle. Although the missile infantry for Antiochus was not included in the ancient sources, contemporary historians believe that the Arab camel archers and the skirmishers were at the forefront. Once more, there are gaps in our knowledge of the battle's early phases. The skirmishers were known to initiate combat, and it appears that this was again the case in this encounter. It is possible to conclude that the Romans prevailed in this instance. According to Livy, the Seleucid missile forces, which used bowstrings, were at a disadvantage since it poured before the conflict. Antiochus's archers began to withdraw behind the main line after taking losses, and as the Roman skirmishers advanced, it became risky to retain the elephants at the front because they had a tendency to grow excited when fired upon. Then the Seleucid center shut down. The Seleucid heir ordered his chariot to counterattack, as he had no light footmen to protect the line. The Roman skirmishers were in a loose configuration, so as the chariots rushed, they were free to disperse and let the enemy through. A scythed chariot was a terrifying weapon against close-quarters formations. Eumenes then dispatched his light cavalry to assault the charioteers, while the skirmishers turned and began firing volleys into them. The remainder became terrified and fled back behind their lines, while several horses and riders were slaughtered. The Seleucid officials realized that the fragrance of the camel may frighten the Roman horses and save the chariot corps, so they dispatched the Arab camel archers to help the charioteers. This had a disastrous outcome, since the chariot riders lost control of their horses and essentially collided with their own camel riders. There are few specifics, but the Seleucid left became disintegrated and was shortly assaulted by the Pergamon king's entire army. Although the heteroi and cataphracts were far more disciplined, they were more accustomed to fighting as an offensive force, and the infantry and light cavalry were unable to repel this charge. They were pushed back then, broken slowly but definitely, due to the battlefield's 5-kilometer breadth, which made it impossible for intelligence to reach the flanks in time. The situation on the Seleucid right was quite different. The Seleucid monarch let his missile infantry pass after realizing they were behind him, and then launched a counteroffensive with his heavy and light cavalry. The opposition in front of them was swiftly dispersed by this charge. The Roman left, who were advancing behind their velites and now occupying a larger area of the battlefield, were startled as the cavalry suddenly formed a single line while moving. Ahenobarbus sent his small cavalry troop to guard the flank in an effort to expand his front. This wasn't enough. The legionary formation's side was now vulnerable to further attacks after the Roman horsemen were destroyed. The opposing formation was apparently shattered here, and the Seleucids began to pursue them in the direction of the camp. After a chase that claimed hundreds of lives, they finally arrived to the camp. Lepidus tried to line up here, but the fear was too great, and his soldiers were told to murder the fleeing legionnaires. Those trying to flee were eventually deterred by the severe punishment. The Roman line was able to put some gap between them and Antiochus, thanks to the Macedonian pikes. The Romans had enough freedom to position their back against the camp's walls because the king's light cavalry, which was meant to assault from behind, were sidetracked by the camp's wealth. Antiochus ordered his troops to break off and return, since he hadn't heard from his army in a while and wasn't in the mood to assault the pikes. As the Roman center advanced, the rest of the Seleucid right tried to defend themselves by joining them after realizing that their center would be encircled. In fact, Antiochus's army corps was quickly surrounded. The Romans attempted but failed for a while to weaken the phalanx with their missiles. Eumenes and Scipio ordered their heavy soldiers to close in, and a unit of cavalry to block the Seleucid leader, who they knew would ultimately return. The Philentites tried to flee towards their own camp by forming a pike wall, but it was challenging because they were being assaulted from all sides. The battalions dispatched to oppose them were quickly defeated by Antiochus's cavalry. But by the time they got there, the phalanx had finally been split, and the Roman cavalry had pursued and slaughtered its frantic members. The bulk of the Seleucid army appears to have been slaughtered or captured, however some forces managed to escape the battlefield. Although we lack reliable sources, it may be inferred that the number of Roman casualties was in the thousands. The largest error Antiochus made was to position himself on the place of honor, which prevented him from directly bringing stability to the situation on his left. Following the fight, the Romans captured Sardis, while Antiochus began to withdraw toward Apamea. Since his empire was large and wealthy enough to support another army, the king wanted to keep fighting. However, even the most powerful rulers should take into account the opinions of their subjects after two crushing defeats. The common people and courtiers both desired peace, so Antiochus sent envoys to negotiate the terms in early 89 BC. The Seleucids accepted the harsh Roman demands without any debate. The vanquished empire was forced to pay 15,000 talents as war reparations and leave the area north of the Taurus Mountains. In addition, the monarch promised not to buy any more elephants in the future and gave up all of his. The Seleucids were prohibited from sailing past Callicadmus and were only permitted to maintain a navy of 10 ships. The king's son, another Antiochus, was among the 20 hostages taken by the Romans. In the end, the Thracian kingdom received the Seleucid domains in Europe, while Rhodes and Pergamon split the Asian territories. However, the peace would not be formalized until the next year, since it needed to be approved by the Roman Senate. The Seleucid Empire was weakened as a result, while Armenia, Atropatene, and Parthia, who were already largely autonomous, rebelled and gained their independence. Antiochus was slain by a mob in Babylon in January 1987. Even though the Seleucid dynasty would continue to govern for another 120 years, their territory would keep getting smaller. To conclude the conflicts, Rome dispatched 2 additional consuls to Greece and Asia Minor in January 1989. The Gnaeus Manlius Vulpso went to war with Galatia, in addition to ensuring that the Seleucids complied with the stipulations of the pact. Although the Galatian War, which the Romans won handily, is outside the purview of this video, it was noteworthy for 2 reasons. It demonstrated that Rome could now invade Asia Minor with ease, and it was the first time a Roman general declared war without the Senate's consent, setting the stage for the Republic's eventual demise. With everything going on in the East, the peace between Rome and Aetolia broke in early 189. The Aetolians then invaded Philip of Macedon and drove him out of Thessaly with ease, taking advantage of the lack of Roman soldiers. Marcus Fulvius Nobiliore, the consul, did however arrive shortly after. He besieged Ambracia with the help of the Aporites, which prompted the Aetolian army to withdraw from Macedon out of fear of being outflanked. Despite Ambracia's months-long resistance, the League realized it couldn't continue without the Seleucids So they began peace talks with Rome through Achaean mediation. Once more, the demands were high, but the Aetolians were forced to comply. The League was forbidden from pursuing a foreign policy without Rome's consent, and it lost half of its members and territory. Despite being theoretically independent, Philip V Demetrius was taken captive by the Romans and came out of the ordeal a devoted Romanophile. With the backing of the Roman Senate, Alexander came back to Macedon with a completely changed mindset. In Pella, the Roman question had caused a rift within the royal court. Demetrius led one of these circles, which was made up of aristocrats who supported peace with Rome. Another faction was made up of firebrands who supported resistance to the invaders and was centered on Philip V and his oldest son, Perseus. Both sides launched a deceptive propaganda campaign. As a low-birth concubine, Perseus's mother was frequently disparaged, suggesting that Perseus was less respectable than Demetrius. At this time, the latter erred by telling a courtier named Didymus that he intended to escape to Rome. Philip was informed right away by this individual, and he also found a letter discussing Demetrius's desire for the throne. On Philip's orders, Didymus poisoned Demetrius in the winter of 181 BC, even though it was most likely a fake. As a result, tensions between Macedonia and Rome increased. After more than 40 years in power, Philip V died at Amphipolis in January, while preparing for a war against the Thracians, further destabilizing the situation. Perseus became the ruler of Macedon after his adversary, Demetrius, was likewise slain. He instantly reaffirmed existing connections and forged new ones, as all new Antigonid monarchs were required to do. After rivals to the throne were vanquished, representatives had to be sent to the Senate in the hopes that they would formally acknowledge Perseus's ascension to the king in this new world ruled by Rome. This was given reluctantly. Perseus established several diplomatic agreements and alliances with the different city-states on the diplomatic front. The Romans were quite irritated by this, of course. In addition, Perseus cleverly wed his sister to Prusias II of Bithynia to the east, and the king himself wed the daughter of Seleucus IV, the king of Seleucia. As a result, Perseus was getting along with the Greeks in the city-states and quickly building a network of helpful Hellenic allies in Asia Minor, much to the ire of Pergamon, which was left out of these affairs. Eumenes, too, its king, performed the customary role of an informant to the Romans. The Roman Senate was amenable to Eumenes's initial demands and warnings. Perseus refused to be intimidated by the young king's repeated Roman threats in January of 1975. He also declined to intimidate the young king. In addition, he put on a magnificent show by leading his whole army in a non-violent procession through Delphi, the holy hub of the Greek civilization. The message was unmistakable. He was the Greeks, not the Romans' defender. The message was unmistakable. He was the Greeks, not the Romans' defender. It was obvious that he was the Greeks, not the Romans' defender. Pergamon's emissaries started pleading with the Roman Senate for assistance in a more frantic manner, and Eumenes personally arrived to make his case in early 172 BC. He asserted that Macedon had fully recovered its might as a result of the peace. The Pergamese monarch finally used his trump card, telling the Romans that he believed it would be very shameful if he didn't make it to Italy in time to warn you before he and his army reached here. Eumenes gained his way by cynically exploiting the post-Hannibalic dread of invaders. The king would realize that the Senate was determined to kill Perseus, and the ensuing diplomatic pressure and inquiries into his actions would become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Romans were eager to fight Perseus, even though Philip V had been the aggressor in the last battle. After being dispatched to negotiate a ceasefire with the Macedonian monarch, Roman envoys claimed that they had fooled him into believing that peace was even possible. As the Romans re-equipped a fleet of ancient ships and led a strong force from Brundisium to Apollonia, the ceasefire was actually only a temporary solution to buy them more time to prepare for war. Not everyone was in favor of this Romans' newfound skill in deceit and devious methods. Senators who were more conservative recalled a period in which the Romans handled their adversaries with dignity and honor. Such approaches proved to be ineffective for managing an empire. In any event, the Roman Senate had determined that having no equals at all was the best way to keep their standing in Greece. The Third Macedonian War started when the Antigonid kingdom had to end. In January, Publius Licinius Crassus, the Roman consul, invaded the Adriatic to seize control of the local legions. Eumenes of Pergamon landed at Chalcis at the same time, with his fleet disembarking with his own 1,000 cavalry and 6,000 soldiers. The Romans rejected the allied ships, keeping just Eumenes' help, because they were unquestionably superior in the Aegean Sea. Taking leadership of the army his father had started to rebuild, Perseus moved south into Thessaly, destroying territory along the way, and set up camp just south of Mount Ossa. Licinius simultaneously conquered the Greek west coast and made his way through Apomania into Thessaly. Upon reaching the Greek city of Larissa, the consul set up camp on a hill just outside the town, where Eumenes' Pergamene army provided reinforcement. Perseus chose to march in the direction of the Roman camp, setting up their own some 5 miles distant, as the Macedonians had become more daring as a result of their unrestrained destruction of the Thessalian countryside. Once his army had slept during the night, Perseus formed his line and led both his light infantry and cavalry forward. The phalangists remained on standby. Medon of Berea led the Macedonian horsemen and Cretan skirmishers on the right, while the Odrysian monarch, Cotys IV, led the Thracian cavalry and light infantry scattered on the left. The king's cavalry and auxiliary men from other foreign countries flanked both flanks, while Perseus's elite agama, the sacred cavalry with 400 slingers in front, formed the center. Licinius's field army positioned its heavy troops safely behind the fortifications of their camp, facing the Macedonians, and dispatched their own cavalry and skirmishers to engage the enemy. Caius Licinius Crassus led the Roman right wing, which was composed of Italian equites with velites strewn among them. Valerius Lavinus led the Greek allied infantry and cavalry on the left. Quintus Mursius commanded a group of Gauls Thessalians and other volunteer cavalry in the middle. Cotys's Thracian cavalry, attacked after the conflict, began with modest casualties on both sides from javelin and slingstone missile fire. Livy described them as fighting like untamed animals and tearing through the Roman cavalry on the right wing. At the same time, the Roman center was broken by Perseus and his elite agama warriors. Perseus was on the verge of ordering his phalanx into combat because he thought he could make the fight a decisive one, but Joander the Cretan convinced him against it. Perseus returned to his camp after thanking Joander for his insightful advice and claiming the win where he could, merely 60 of Perseus's soldiers had perished, while 2,000 Roman infantrymen and 200 Roman cavalry had perished. After this fight, there were other skirmishes, but the 171 BC campaigning season was all but done. The anti-Roman towns of Boeotia were subsequently destroyed by the Romans. After a brief siege, Aleardus was totally destroyed. 2,500 men were sold into slavery, and the town was left in ruins for many years. Together with Perseus's triumph at Callinicus, this kind of increasingly well-known Roman brutality in Greece gave the Macedonian monarch the appearance of being the Greeks' savior. The Molossians of Epirus did desert, but the majority of those who thought thus were still too afraid of Rome to act. The Romans seemed to be losing this war, one setback after another, and it was only made worse when Perseus successfully raided the Roman navy at Aureus, burning ships and contaminating food supplies. But Perseus was aware that he required a resounding triumph in combat. Rome's position in Greece seemed unstable by the end of January 1969, and it wasn't until 168 BC that Lucius Aemilius Paulus, the next consul, revived the faltering Roman cause in Greece. Aemilius commanded a sizable army consisting of 2 highly fortified Roman and allied legions that were drawn from the Etruscans and Samnites for a total of about 22,000 legionary heavy infantry. Thousands more light infantry, mainly velites, and soldiers from Pergamon and the city-state allies supported the heavier troops. Additionally, 4,000 horsemen, including 1,000 of the notorious Numidian cavalry under their lord Miscegenesus, mounted up in the Roman army. 22 massive war elephants accompanied the North African forces. In contrast, Perseus had about 4,000 horses and 44,000 feet. The formidable phalangists, with their sarissa pikes and phalanx formation that stretched a mile, made up 21,000 of the infantry. Light infantry and auxiliary forces like the Illyrian archers and Thracian javelinmen supported this moving wall of pikes. Aemilius marched south after entering Thessaly in January and met Perseus at the base of Mount Olympus, where he had gathered his troops in a position that could be easily defended. Just east of the mountain, on the west bank of the Elpius River, the Antigonids were buried, and they had easy access to Diem, a neighboring town. With characteristic Roman tenacity, it appears that Perseus's advantageous position did not deter the legionaries, who were anxious to restore their honor after Callinicus, and pushed Aemilius to launch an urgent attack. In response, Aemilius emphasized that his troops would fight when and how he instructed them to, and he warned them to remember their position. Aemilius gave Publius Cornelius Scipio Narnassica, a subordinate, the task of leading 3,500 allied troops and 5,000 legionaries in a feint towards the sea in an attempt to drive Perseus out of his defensive position. He would startle Perseus by marching via an unprotected path under the cover of darkness. A Cretan auxiliary in the Roman army defected and told his fellow Greeks about the Roman scheme, which may have given them the advantage over Macedon's ruler. In response to this concerning information, Perseus dispatched a commander by the name of Milo, along with 10,000 Thracian mercenaries and 2,000 Macedonians, to block the Roman entrance. Nausicaa had already authorized a charge upon his arrival, but he had not anticipated this opposition. Nausicaa himself is said to have faced a formidable Thracian soldier head-to-head and killed him with a pilum javelin during the violent and vicious mountain battles that took place in cramped passageways and defiles. The Macedonians ran back to the main army and told Perseus of the setback as Rome's legionaries relentlessly hacked and stabbed their way through the mountain pass. The monarch promptly decamped and marched away from the mountain after realizing that losing it would make his position vulnerable. Perseus gathered his force behind a river on the plain below, close to the town of Pydna, while Emilius crossed the mountain pass and emerged into the slopes around Mount Olycrus. The Macedonian phalanx found the hand-picked battlefield ideal, and Perseus's location behind the river and on a little ridge offered him a clear advantage. Knowing this, Emilius stayed in his camp on the hills and did not go forward quite yet. The general's officers, particularly Nausicaa, soon grew agitated and desired to launch an assault right now. Emilius grinned stoically and cautioned Nausicaa against making such a premature move, explaining the foolishness of striking a phalanx on such footing. For that night, the Romans did not set up a marching camp. The moon abruptly turned from white to a drab crimson as night fell, and the troops were sleeping in their tents and relaxing around the many campfires. What appeared to be a bad omen shocked and upset the superstitious men in the Macedonian camp. Had Zeus deserted them? The moon appeared to be bleeding red. The similarly devout Romans, however, did not respond with such severity. What caused this Caius Sulpicius Gallus, a Roman army military tribune, was an accomplished astronomer. He went up to his general the day before and asked for his approval to gather the troops and tell them that a solar eclipse will take place the next evening. He advised the soldiers that such occurrences were normal, foreseeable, and natural, and should not be interpreted as bad luck. As a result, the Roman troops just obeyed their commander's instructions to sacrifice to the Greek gods during the eclipse, vowing to honor Heracles with festivities. The Roman troops' morale remained unaltered, and the gestures were effective. It would take a spark to light the fires as the two leaders engaged in a risky staring duel. A wayward mule was the source of the spark. Lighter infantry led a small train of mules down to a creek behind the slopes to fill jugs of water for the thirsty Roman soldiers who wore heavy armor. One of the dry pack animals reportedly sniffed the water and ran away from its captors like the obstinate beasts they are. As the water gatherers chased after it, they saw that some of Perseus's Thracian soldiers were following suit. In addition, the enemy was trying to take their mule. A fight broke out over the donkey because the angry, irate, and scalding Roman troops were unwilling to part with it. The mule most likely just fled, but runners on both sides proceeded to seek assistance. Perseus marched his whole army out of the camp and directly into the fight at the stream after spotting an opening to lure the Romans down from the rugged foothills of Mount Olycrus. When the Romans saw what was happening from their camp, they were enraged and aggressively demanded that they be let to march out and engage in combat. Emilius delivered the order to gather as he feared mutiny if he didn't comply. He gave his legions only a few seconds to gather, and then he ordered the charge, intending to rescue the troops at the stream. The command to drop their pikes was then delivered to the advancing phalangists. The ranks behind them maintained a 45-degree angle as the 5 ranks retained their sares horizontally in sync. Then they moved forward. The phalangists encountered virtually no significant opposition and just ripped through the opposing ranks against the hardly armored Roman light infantry, whose primary task was to engage in skirmishes from a distance. An auxiliary tribe leader called Salvius, retrieved the flag of his unit and tossed it into the phalanx in a valiant attempt to buy the Romans additional time. The agitated troops were inspired by this and made a valiant effort to regain it. Although it caused enormous deaths, this halted the phalanx's approach and let some troops escape. The swarm of velites and other skirmishers hurled their missiles at the phalanx, largely ineffective as Aemilius's main army began to close in. After seeing their less heavily armored friends being massacred, the legionary heavy infantry grew alarmed and started to slow down. Their spirits began to drop as they saw the steamroller's enormous size coming at them. If Aemilius didn't take action immediately, his soldiers with short swords would be slain on the level terrain. Therefore, the general gave the order to leave right away and gave Perseus the plains heading once more toward the foothills. Aemilius now had some breathing room to strike since the withdrawal was executed smoothly, thanks to the Roman legion's extraordinary discipline. He wheeled his horse to the right flank and gave the command for the 34 elephant wing to rush forward, followed by a cavalry mass. The mercenary and Thracian skirmishers that were directly in the line of this charge were forces trained to cope with elephants, but they were too tired to focus enough missiles. On a terrible day, they were captured by the elephant vanguard and cut a bleeding hole in Perseus' left wing. The agema, on the leftmost edge of the phalanx, was thus left fully exposed as the cavalry swept around the remaining elephants and wiped them up. The triumphant Roman right wing pursued the fleeing combatants before gradually reorganizing just behind Perseus' line. The phalanx had been following the retreating legions into the foothills and into rocky ground during this conflict on the field's edge. The rightmost legionary unit, already cleared of the infantry screen, swung inward, driving into the leftmost vulnerable part of the phalanx. Meanwhile, as the terrain became more irregular, holes slowly started to appear in the phalanx. Using this to his advantage, Aemilius rode up and down the line, yelling for his soldiers to charge. The Roman centurions knew what they were doing, whether or not he was heard, and they led their troops into the Macedonian phalanx's now exposed arteries. Now, the pressure started to build. The phalanx started to gradually disintegrate as it engaged in adverse close-quarters fighting and was struck on the flank. From the back of the infantry block, Aemilius, who had withdrawn to a command post on the heights, observed little streams of Antigonid soldiers escaping. The now regrouped Roman right flank provided the coup de grace. Now, the elephants and cavalry surged toward Perseus's crumbling army, completely overwhelming it. The 3,000 elite members of Perseus's agema were the last to fall. While their monarch escaped on his horse, these brave soldiers battled to the death and did not abandon a single one. Alexander the Great's military legacy was ultimately laid to rest when one of the finest phalanxes in history was destroyed. 20,000 of Perseus's soldiers were slain, while 11,000 others, including Perseus himself, were taken prisoner. The Senate bestowed to Aemilius the title of Macedonicus. With the Macedonian treasures and his triumphant army marching behind him, the victorious commander was declared a victor and drove into Rome on his chariot. Following the conflict, the Antigonid kingdom was divided into 4 semi-states or merides, each with a capital and elected officials, but subject to Roman rules, since Macedon proven to be too dangerous for Rome to permit to maintain its independence. The areas were not permitted to establish their own foreign policy trade or intermarry. but they were permitted to maintain small garrisons at their boundaries with foreign tribes. An exorbitant tribute given to Rome, together with prohibitions on shipbuilding, forestry, and the extraction of gold and silver, severely depressed their economy. Furthermore, the Molossians who backed Perseus were retaliated against by the Romans. 50,000 Epirotes were forced into slavery, and 70 of their cities were destroyed. The result of all of this was poverty and discontent, which turned the people against the Romans. Those who would make use of this soon emerged. Born in Adramyttium in Asia Minor, a young man named Andriscos had a striking likeness to the late Macedonian king Perseus. In 150 BC, he began to convince everyone he knew that he was the king's son Philip, and that he intended to bring Antigonid power back to Macedon. Because the local aristocracy was content with Roman governance, Andriscos' attempt to win support in Macedon was unsuccessful. The impostor was eventually taken into Roman captivity after he tried to enlist the help of Demetrius I, the Seleucid monarch. But the latter had his own internal issues and didn't want to enrage the Romans. Andriscos was transported to Magna Graecia to live in jail, since the Senate did not think he was dangerous, but he was able to escape and ended up at Miletus. He began seeking followers once more, and he was able to win them over among the anti-Roman residents. After that, Andriscos went to Thrace, where he was given a small force by the local rulers who were concerned about extending Roman power. The impostor invaded Macedon in early 119 BC. However, we don't know all the specifics. Somewhere in Otamantus, the nobles' forces were routed, despite their best efforts to muster an army to oppose him. Thus, Andriscos reinstated the Macedonian monarchy and ascended to the throne as Philip VI. While the ordinary populace rejoiced in their independence, pro-Roman aristocracy saw their status decline. It was the start of the Fourth Macedonian War. He attacked the Thessalian League, a Roman ally, the same year. The time was ideal since the Republic's top generals were occupied with fighting in Spain's Lusitanian War and besieging Carthage during the Third Punic War. In an attempt to gain time for his Achaean allies and the neighboring Pergamene garrisons to join him, Publius Cornelius Scipio Nasica, the local Roman commander, marched for Thessaly and began talks with Andriscos. Joining him are the allies and the neighboring Pergamene garrisons. In fact, these allies, along with one Italian legion, strengthened the general. This told Andriscos that his foes were growing more powerful, so he invaded and destroyed the allies, capturing much of Thessaly in the process. Motivated Andros Gauss dispatched emissaries to Carthage, proposing the restoration of the previous coalition. The winter put an end to the fighting, but the Romans were as vivacious as ever. Praetor Quintus Caecilius Metellus, a veteran of the Third Macedonian War, was tasked with organizing a new army. His legions set off aboard Pergamon transports in the beginning of 1848. In the past, the Roman soldiers would land in Epirus and then proceed southward into the Greek heartland, but Metellus chose to outmaneuver his rival and land in Macedon. This put Andriscos' kingdom in jeopardy and had him work twice as hard to defeat the enemy. 20 years ago, the destiny of the Third Macedonian War was decided at Hydna, where the two sides clashed. The conflict is regrettably little understood, and even the number of fighters is unknown. The conflict began when the two armies' cavalry vanguards clashed with the Macedonian horsemen, having the advantage and driving their opponents away. That gave Andriscos more confidence to to send some of his soldiers back to Thessaly to carry on the conquest. The infantry engaged in combat in the middle as soon as the major forces were in close proximity. At first, the two groups of footmen battled to a standstill, and it appears that the war would ultimately come down to a clash between riders. However, the specifics are lost to time once more, and it is unclear if the Macedonians fought in their typical phalanx. The cavalry commander, a nobleman called Telestos, betrayed Andraskos at that point. Attacked from every direction, the Macedonian center was nearly destroyed. Andriskos tried to escape to Thrace after the fight, but his friends didn't want to further infuriate the victorious party. After being taken prisoner, Andriskos was assigned the Fourth Macedonian War. Macedon did not even receive a semblance of independence this time. Under the Senate's leadership, Metellus became the governor of Macedonia and incorporated the Ionian Islands, southern Illyria, Epirus, and Macedon into the province. But elsewhere in Greece, things were becoming tense. For a while, Menalcetus' Sparta had been attempting to secede from the Achaean League. Their delegation traveled to Rome in 147 to request help from the Senate, but the strategos of the League Democritus attacked Spartan territory before the Romans could react. Although Menalcetus was vanquished, the Achaeans were unable to capture the city. Democritus was overthrown for such, and the even more radical D took his place. A.S. The Achaean assembly met with a Roman delegation at that time. Unexpectedly, for the Achaeans, the embassy sought Argos, Corinth, and Achaemenus, in addition to supporting Sparta's independence, possibly in an attempt to incite violence. Clearly, refusing the Achaeans dispatched their own embassy to Rome to demand that the decision be revoked. The Senate rejected it. The Achaean War began in 146 BC, when the Achaean League and other Greeks, supported by the Boeotians and Euboeans, waged war against the Roman Republic because they were obviously upset over the Roman conquest of Macedonia and Epirus. Critolaus, another anti-Roman strategos, was elected, and his army marched for Thessaly with the help of the Thebans. However, Metellus's Roman army captured them at a location known as Scarsa in Locris before they could make it to Thermopylae. The Greeks were unprepared for the combat. The commander was killed and their army was routed. The Roman governor then proceeded south. The archives were destroyed as they tried to halt his march in Chaeronea. D. After assuming leadership of Achaea A.S., quickly assembled an army of 16,000 soldiers in the hopes of defending the Isthmus of Corinth. Regretfully, for him, Lucius Mummius, the consul, and a Pergamene detachment added to the Roman army, increasing its size to 27,000 soldiers. Leucopetra is where the two sides met. Again, there aren't many specifics available. Even though they were outnumbered 2-1, the Romans apparently had no desire to rush over the tiny isthmus. The Roman army stayed in the camp for a while, and it appears that they became comfortable as D.A.S. was able to strike the camp and cause significant fatalities with his light infantry. With the Pergamon navy at their side, the Romans marched straight at the enemy the following day. A was compelled to take the fight. The Achaeans were able to halt the legionaries when the two infantry bodies collided in the middle. But the Romans made use of Dias's meager number of horsemen. Mummius's cavalry routed their opponents on both flanks before launching an all-out assault on the Greek infantry. The Achaean army as a whole was routed, and the fight was essentially finished. Later, like Carthage, months before Corinth was destroyed by the Romans. The city was destroyed by fire. All women and children were sold into slavery, and all men were slaughtered. Rome had no economic partners in the Mediterranean as a result, and as the Republic could not be opposed militarily, the Achaean League, the Italian League, and others were dissolved, and the whole area was included into the Macedonian province. Despite two further uprisings in Macedon and Greek towns' effort to back Pontus during the First Mithridatic War, Greece would be ruled by the Romans for years to come. An excellent illustration of the imperial divide et impera concept was the Roman conquest of Greece, in which the Republic was able to align one group against the other and maintain perpetual division among all the towns, states, and leagues until the time came to capture all. Nevertheless, Greek culture thrived and played a significant role in the Pax Romana Christianity. The Muslim Golden Age, the Renaissance, and the Age of Enlightenment throughout the course of the following 2 millennia. In our upcoming videos, we will discuss Greek and Roman history in greater detail. Don't forget to like, share, and comment. It truly helps our channel grow. Our films are made possible by the invaluable support of our YouTube channel members and patrons. Become a part of this community and enjoy benefits such as early video access. See you on the next Sleep Stories TV video.